Hello, and welcome to this episode of Keeping Her Keys. Today I'm sharing the final in the 3-part series featuring all of the key bearers and torchbearers in Covina, our coven of Hecate. This time we are talking about what it means to be a witch in the world, about navigating spaces, boundaries, openness to new experience and connections. And this is all in the spirit of the final chapter of entering Hecate's cave, Kore, the reborn. So like Persephone did in the spring, emerging from the underworld, we're diving into how do we emerge from our own personal caves to make those valuable connections and at the same time keep ourselves safe. I hope you enjoy this episode. So, my lovelies, we have come to the point in the journey, if you're following in entering Hecate's cave, where we get to the end, Kore, the reborn one. And this chapter is all about emerging. It's about finishing our time down below, the interior, the healing, introspection, and so on. And now we're going back out into the world. And how do we navigate that world? That's what we're here to talk about today. And, I think the pandemic really made this something we could understand because we all went through this, right? We were forced to stay home for our own good. So if we were doing like psycho-spiritual work and healing, and we're kind of retreating from others into Hecate's cave, to take good care of ourselves and nourish our practice and all those things. And then we decide, well, let's go back out into the world. But during the pandemic, we were forced to do this. And then we had to figure out how to emerge. How do we go back out into the world? And I think for all of us, if you identify as, like a witch, as queer, just as Hecateans, like in intersecting with the mainstream society, we can be very different. Like we might have different values, different ethics, see the world differently. I'm an animist, so I see that nature is spirited and enchanted and alive and important. That can put us in situations when someone feels like that nature is a resource to be exploited and to make money off of. There's all these different ways that when we are out in the world, we can run into these situations. But at the same time, just like when we emerged after the pandemic, there is a fundamental human need to connect. And to connect with like-minded people. Like I'm so thankful for technology, Hail Mercury, because as a Hecatean, I've always been thus for many years. And being able to use technology to form real relationships with you all and to talk about Hecate, like that's so valuable because it gives me that sense of connection and community that for years I was the only one at the Thursday night at the pagan gathering at the coffee house at all interested in Hecate. So I was like the oddball even among the pagans and witches because no one was into Hecate 20 years ago. But it's given me a sense of community. But it's also looping back to like, how do we feel safe when we do that in this world? So this is what I want to talk about, because I do think it is important for us to go out into the world and try new things, right? We wouldn't be together today if all of us hadn't been willing to connect with each other and to try something different, to take that risk. And it's so valuable. Okay, who wants to go first? Talking about how they do this, navigating between opening up and connecting. Okay, Leah, are you ready?
I'd love to go first.
Okay.
First of all, I want to circle back to, I love what you were saying about the pandemic, because this was the worldwide phenomenon where folks were actually forced to introspect And what came out of the world was immense creativity. For example, Taylor Swift dropped an amazing album, two albums. You also had the Great Resignation. People started to say, who am I and what's important to me? So as soon as the world opened up, they all changed jobs to
Mhm.
align with what was fulfilling and also what was deserving, better pay. And then that was that other aspect. This concept of work-life balance and wellness really entered our culture, and the importance of taking care of ourselves. So that's why I think is really tied into the whole re-emerging from the cave. We kind of saw it on a global scale of, oh, you know what? Part of being that reborn core is I'm respecting myself, I'm taking care of myself, I know who I am, I have boundaries. So that's kind of where my thoughts are starting off.
All right, I love that. And boundaries are so important for a sense of safety in the world. I guess what got me started thinking that I wanted us to have this conversation was I was out in the world doing something, and I was I walked by like an employee only area. Do you know what I mean? Like you're in a place and but I had to go there to do something. And they had all these posters on the walls, and one of the posters said, assume positive intent. And you have those moments and you look at something and you just stop in your tracks and be like, that'd be the last thing I'd do, especially in a place like this. But then I was thinking, I understand what the poster is getting at in terms of treating the clientele of this organization, assume that they are not out to get you, that they don't have malicious undertones in their interactions, like assume positive intent. The people who are serving are doing the best they can. But then I also thought about like emerging, especially being me, all through my life, I would never assume positive intent, especially in a risky situation, because I am very wary of strangers and how they might judge me. And I'm very protective of what's mine. So I don't assume positive intent. For me, I have to get to know you before I can think that you won't cause trouble in my life.
And that goes back to the safety. It's
Right.
like you have to feel safe first.
I did an older episode on being the witch in the room. And if you are the witch in the room, in one sense, that gives us a lot of power and confidence. It can. But in another sense, it can put us maybe at what we perceive as heightened risk for discrimination and bias. People think that we're weirdos or that we'll curse them. I kind of like it when people think that I will curse them. I'm fine with that. It doesn't bother me. For me, it only bothers me if I ever thought it might negatively impact my children. In terms of me personally, like whatever. I think it's fine. I'll curse you. Not any of you here are watching, but those people over there, I have no problem.
Was gonna say, like, not even just like being the witch in the room, but like not assuming positive intent with everyone in our lives. Like that's really dangerous. Like it's like a really passive mindset that like perpetuates abusers being able to do what they do. And I know I've shared with you guys before, but I'm gonna bring up the quote from this TV show that I watched recently. It's called Marry My Husband. You can find it on Amazon Prime if you're curious. But it's all about recovering from people pleasing and, like recognizing that not everyone in your life has good intents. And the quote is that even like understanding has its limits. Like bad people will not care about the fact that you are understanding of them. Being in Covina, I'm really working on like how I set boundaries and stuff. Like I see a lot of that in my life where like there was something recently where like somebody said something to me and it was a friend of mine. And I was like, oh, like it really bothered me. And I was like, I don't think they meant anything by it. Like, I don't think that they meant something bad or that this was intentional, but I was like, I'm going to set the boundary anyway because that's my values now after practicing all of this. Like I want to bring it out of the cave with me. And I set the boundary, and the response I got was like, oh, it was intentional. Like they did actually mean it the way that I thought. And so it's like you can't just assume that people don't mean the bad thing. Like it's better to protect yourself and know, because you know, if I'd set that boundary with somebody who maybe didn't mean it that way, they'd be like, oh my gosh, no, so sorry. But like, it's not going to affect the relationship if the relationship is healthy. I don't know. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I just really appreciate like you're not only are you setting boundaries, you're like following up on it. Like, you know, because a lot of times there might be boundaries, but if you won't have those conversations with people, like what did you mean?
I don't appreciate this behavior. Like, this is how it feels. I'm not going to tolerate certain things. So.
Calling people to task, which I think is also standing in our own power. Like, but it's also in our fighting when it's not worth it. How do we, as highly energetic practitioners, use these skills, you know, to make just decisions based on what the most appropriate response is? And if it doesn't feel right, it ain't right.
Mm-hmm.
People can tell us whatever they're going to tell us. But if we are emerging as a core reborn with vitality and creating our own lives and doing all of this, practicing our craft and our goddess devotion, we're doing all of this. It should empower us, and we are not wrong. Like, we are not wrong. And I think there's a lot of apologizing that can go on. Like, I'm sorry, I am the way I am, but it makes me feel good to be this way. It's like, no, I'm just the way I am. But it's also not rude, right? It's not forcing yourself. It's having like dignity, I think is a big part of it for me. I don't need, when I walk into a room, to share my spot.
Mm-hmm.
Unless that's what I'm there for. But if I'm at the bank, well, it's me, so I'll probably do spells to Mercury and so on before. But in the bank, I'm not going to start talking of that kind of stuff because it's the bank.
So that's still like performative and egotistical because it's in a space where it's inappropriate. It's like having that boundary with yourself and like your shadow that maybe wants attention. When is it appropriate for me to advertise that I'm a witch, or if you're a Christian or something like that? Like,
because it's so annoying when other people do it. Like when Christians try to force themselves on us, right?
Mm-hmm. But I think also like it's okay to protect your own energy. That's key. I'm thinking about like awareness first and foremost, but also healthy skepticism. And I kind of want to flip this to the other side and talk about openness. You think about standing in your power, you're loaded and you're grounded. And I always like to call it like soul fire maintenance, right? This self-empowerment state that you're in. How boundaries, healthy boundaries need to be somewhat permeable. The analogy that I always use was like you need airflow for fire to grow, right? Mm-hmm. You want to be protective of your energy, but also be like very conscious of who you allow in and how you reach out.
That's so true. You know, it's like determining what might be a safe space and that the risk is worth it in the space that I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to say who I am, to reach out, you know, to connect, to join a group or whatever it is. Like those risks are so important because of our need for connection and
Mm-hmm.
and to be with people who are similar to us.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of times, like even in our own homes, there might not be other practicing witches in our home, right? Maybe we might be living with atheists or whatever it is we're living with. I think we really need to have that connection. Because there's that sense of like kinship that comes from people who see the world similarly to you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we do have to have permeable boundaries. We have to have boundaries, but with the right people. It's about letting the right ones in,
right,
and trusting the right ones. And I think for a lot of us, if we've been through a lot in our lives, like the kind of the source material is that when we trust people, we have bad things happen. So I think it can just get kind of extended that we don't trust anybody, or that we're so eager to have that kind of community and connection, we'll trust anybody. So there needs to be like that element of discernment, that we're banishing what harms us and we're connecting within a protective space to what nourishes us. Merging is worth it. To see ourselves as the architects of our own life, as the creator, it's our tending to our soul fire. Melanie, what are your notes on this whole business?
I think for me, it really does come back to boundaries. Like Kristen was saying about boundaries being permeable, and Alyssa commented on that too. Like that for me is really what came from the pandemic. Like it really taught me a lot about my boundaries because I had that time away from other people and others had that time away from me. And over time, it's like from my own experience, I have a lot of boundaries that I tend to renew around this time of year in rebirth and just like recommit to like, yes, I will express myself as a witch in these ways, with the jewelry I wear, or the certain clothes that I wear, or whatever. But if I'm in these situations, certain situations, or with certain people, it's not something that I'm going to talk about. Like I'm still going to express it in certain ways, but becoming more comfortable in expressing parts of my personality that others might find offensive or whatever title you want to apply to it. um that's an example of how my boundaries I think have become more permeable. But yeah, it's like carrying that, it's having that integrity to carry those boundaries that you've set for yourself forward while also leaving a little bit of wiggle room for them, to grow and change so that you have that opportunity to connect with other people, especially people you may not expect to connect with.
I think that's a really good point. And, for me, like we live in such a divisive, troubled world where it's like people latch onto one piece of their identity. And if the other person that you're in the exchange with or the other group, they have a contrary view to that piece of who you are, that immediately we pillory them. They're horrible people. And I think, like in like this, we do live in a troubled world. And I think this is a lot of the root of the trouble, is that if I don't agree with you on this one thing, you're a horrible person.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you were getting at, Melanie. It's like we might have this practice, these beliefs, and other people might not have them, but that doesn't mean we still can't have a lot in common with them and have great relationships with them.
Mhm.
Like when I think about the friend group of moms, that I had for years, like definitely in terms of spirituality, they were Christians. And I think only one of them I ever felt like she was really harsh in her view of me, and I wouldn't consider her a friend at all. But most, it was just like, but we have these children and we're doing all these activities together. And you know what? We love our kids. We love having these little parties and doing these social events together. And that's okay. It doesn't always need to be with people who are just like me when it comes to spirituality.
Right. And you can't always have the expectation that those differences are going to be the only thing that you ever talk about. Because like I experienced that with my in-laws all the time. And it's like we don't agree on everything, especially my mother-in-law, but like I have gotten to the point within my own experience where I've made it very clear, like this is my past and we're cool. We just don't really talk about it. But sometimes I think it's important, like if it's a boundary that you don't really want to talk about, you do have to make it clear just so that others, won't try to cross that line. Does that make sense?
Right.
Like not maybe not, and I don't mean that necessarily in an adversarial way, but just make it like, oh, well, I'm not really engaging in this conversation that you're having over here because of this boundary that I have. And then maybe they'll have that conversation in the room next to where you are instead of trying to rope you into it. So yeah.
Yeah, or it can even be like a gentle redirect. Like they could ask you a question and you'll say, my spirituality is private. What I'd really like to talk with you about is, did you see that sunrise? Or whatever, whatever it is. And to try to find like common ground in those unsafe spaces when possible. I mean, sometimes you just need to get the hell out of there, like to be honest. But like you said, if these are people you value and you care about and they're, and you have close relationships with them, like it's like how do you navigate your emergence when they might have some very different ideas about our spirituality? But I mean, overall, like, they want you to do good in the world. like, and be good and be happy and whatever the circumstances are. Like, most people don't really want you to have a horrible life. And I think it's really complicated. And then there's the whole thing of taking up space. Like, we have a right to be heard. And we matter. Alyssa, what are you saying?
I was gonna say that, like, for me, when there's people who I don't necessarily want to talk about, like, what exactly Covina is, or like, the witchcraft and stuff, but like, I know that they'll have an interest in, like, the self-healing or like the psychological stuff. Like, I just describe it from a different angle, and it's
Right.
like, they'll agree. I don't know. It's kind of like, I don't know, I feel like I do it with my in-laws and my parents and things, too. Like when I would talk to them about like climate change or something, describe it from a way that, like, avoids the words that they're not gonna like. But, like if I'm talking to someone, like someone asked me while I was at this wedding recently, where they were like, "Oh, what's Covina?" Because I just happened to mention it. And I was like, "Oh, it's like a psycho-spiritual like healing group." I wasn't like, "It's a coven and I practice witchcraft," and like, because I
Right.
didn't feel safe, with those people expressing that part of my identity. I don't know.
A lot about it is just, like tapping into that intuition, like our ability to perceive beyond the five senses. Like what is really going on here? Am I safe in this situation? Can I kind of spread my wings and fly and carve out space? Or is this not a place that I belong? There's a lot to it. And I just hope everybody who's witnessing our conversation, I hope you find your way, to have those permeable boundaries, to be protected, but also connected, and to not be isolated within yourself, and to not deny your right to take up space in the world. I think that, and to do it in ways that, help you stay safe as well. So thanks so much for hanging out with us for this conversation. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Keeping Her Keys abides at the crossroads between modern life and the deeper world of goddesses, natural magic, and witchcraft that leads to healing and personal empowerment. You can learn more about my teaching and writing and find loads of resources at keepingherkeys.com. The Keeping Her Keys podcast is produced and hosted by me, Cyndi Brannon. You can learn more about me at the website, too. My frequent co-host and co-producer is the fabulous Christen Bennett, and the original music is provided by my son, Aidan O'Brien. Thanks for listening. Hail Hecate.